Sure.
There's 500,000 people there. I come running out and I look down there and I see a bunch of people look a lot like me, except they're naked.
Yeah.
And,
Naked, yeah.
And they're asleep.
Yeah.
It's 1972, and Creedence Clearwater Revival, the band that ruled American rock for the past 4 years, just announced they're done. No drugs, no scandals, no arrests, no commercial failures. 14 consecutive top 10 singles, 5 consecutive top 10 albums, 2 #1 records. They played Woodstock. They outsold the Beatles in 1969, and now they're breaking up. Just like that. How does a band at the absolute top of the world fall apart this fast? Here's the answer most people give. John Fogerty was too controlling. He wrote every song. He produced every album. He made every decision.
They were all kind of piled together. It looked like one of those pictures of the souls coming up out of hell.
Yeah.
Like Dante's Inferno or something,
And eventually, the other 3 guys in the band got tired of being told what to do. That answer is true, but it's not the whole truth. Because the real problem wasn't that John Fogerty controlled too much. It's that Creedence Clearwater Revival needed him to. He built a machine so perfect, so efficient, so reliant on one person's standards that when anyone else tried to touch the controls, the whole thing fell apart. And what happened after the breakup was even worse than the breakup itself. Brothers who stopped speaking, lawsuits that lasted decades, a man sued for plagiarizing himself, a widow who brought her husband's ashes to what was supposed to be a celebration and watched the surviving members refuse to play together. This is the story of the fastest implosion in rock history, and it starts in a junior high school music room.
Well, I hope you're enjoying some of this. We're having a great time up here. We just want you to like us, We're rocking out. Hey, out there, about a quarter mile, some guy's flicking his lighter. He says, "Don't worry about it, John. We're with ya."
El Cerrito, California, 1959. A small working-class town on the east side of San Francisco Bay. Not glamorous, not famous. The kind of place where kids played in garages because there was nothing else to do. Doug Clifford was 14 years old. He walked into the music room at Portola Junior High and noticed another kid sitting at the piano, playing Fats Domino, note for note, like he'd memorized the record. Doug walked over and said, "That's authentic Fats." The kid looked up. "Yeah, what do you play?" "Drums. You want to form a band?" "Yeah, but actually I play guitar." That kid was John Fogerty, and that conversation is where everything begins. They pulled in Doug's friend Stu Cook, who played piano at the time but would eventually switch to bass. And a little while later, they connected with John's older brother Tom, who was already playing guitar in his own band without much success. Tom was 4 years older. He had the vision of a career. He was the first one who said this could be more than a hobby. They called themselves the Blue Velvets. They played covers, rock and roll instrumentals, Fats Domino, Little Richard, Bo Diddley. 4 kids from the suburbs doing their best impression of the South they'd never visited.
So in front of 500,000 people for the rest of my big Woodstock concert, I played for that guy.
Yeah.
They released a few singles on a tiny local label called Orchestra Records. Nothing happened. Then they signed with Fantasy Records, a small jazz label based just down the road in Berkeley. The owner at the time saw potential, but didn't know what to do with a rock band on a jazz label. They changed the band's name to the Gollywogs and released a string of singles between 1964 and 1967 that nobody bought. Then, in 1967, a man named Saul Zaentz bought Fantasy Records. And this is where the tragedy really begins, because Zaentz offered the band a chance to record a full album. A real shot. All they had to do was sign a contract. They signed. They were young. They were hungry. They'd been playing together for 8 years with nothing to show for it. They didn't read the fine print. Almost nobody does at that age. But the fine print said that Fantasy owned everything. The recordings, the publishing rights, the songs. Every note John Fogerty would write under that contract belonged to Saul Zaentz. John didn't know it at the time. None of them did. But that contract would haunt him for the next 50 years. For 8 years, these 4 guys played together and went absolutely nowhere. But something was changing inside John Fogerty during those years. Something quiet. Something that would eventually define everything. He was getting better. Not just better. Obsessively, relentlessly, almost frighteningly better. While the others treated the band as one part of their lives, John treated it as his entire life. He practiced until his fingers bled. He studied songwriting like it was architecture. He listened to records the way engineers read blueprints, pulling them apart piece by piece until he understood how they worked. And at some point during those lost years, a shift happened. Tom had always been the lead singer. But John had something Tom didn't. Tom himself would later admit it. He said, "I could sing, but John had a sound." That one sentence explains everything that came after. In 1966, both John and Doug got drafted. John joined the Army Reserve. Doug went into the Coast Guard Reserve. They served their time and came back. And when John returned, something in him had hardened. The dreamer had become a machine. He changed the band's name. No more Gollywogs. They would be Creedence Clearwater Revival. He took over as lead singer. He became the primary songwriter, the primary producer, the primary decision maker, the primary everything. And in 1968, something extraordinary happened. They released their debut album. A cover of Dale Hawkins' Susie Q became a massive hit. And then John Fogerty started writing songs faster than most bands could learn them. What followed was one of the most explosive creative runs in the history of recorded music. And to understand why it matters, you need to understand the pace. Most bands release an album every year or two, maybe faster if they're hungry. Creedence released 3 albums in 1969 alone. 3. In a single calendar year. Bayou Country came first. January. Proud Mary. Born on the Bayou. 2 songs that would be played on American radio every single day for the next 5 decades. Proud Mary alone would become so iconic that Tina Turner's version would later make people forget who wrote it. That's how deep these songs got into the culture. They stopped belonging to the band and started belonging to America. Green River came in August, the title track. Bad Moon Rising. Lodi. Wrote a song for everyone. Every one of them a classic. The album hit #1. Willie and the Poor Boys dropped in November. Down on the Corner. Fortunate Son. And Fortunate Son became something bigger than a hit. It became the sound of Vietnam. The sound of class resentment. The sound of working-class kids being sent to die while senators' sons stayed home. It wasn't just a protest song. It was a grenade thrown at the American establishment. And John Fogerty, a guy who'd served in the Army Reserve himself, pulled the pin. 3 albums, 1 year, all of them hits, all of them written by one person, produced by one person, arranged by one person, sung by one person, led by one person. John Fogerty wasn't just the frontman, he was the engine, the fuel, the steering wheel, and the roadmap. The band existed because he willed it to exist. The songs existed because he sat alone in a room and built them from nothing. And here's where the problem starts to take shape. Because nobody noticed it yet. Nobody called it a problem. Not when every album went gold. Not when every single climbed the charts. Not when they played Woodstock in 1969 as the first major act to sign on. But inside the band, something was quietly breaking. Tom felt sidelined. He'd been the original leader, the older brother, the one with the vision, and now his younger brother had taken everything. The singing, the songwriting, the decision-making. Tom's only role was rhythm guitar. He stood on stage every night playing parts that John had written, singing harmonies that John had arranged, following a vision that John controlled completely. Stu and Doug had their own frustrations. They wanted a say in the business decisions. They wanted creative input. They wanted to feel like partners, not employees. But here's the question nobody wanted to ask. Would the band have been as successful if John had shared control? Would Fortunate Son exist if it had been written by committee? Would Proud Mary hit the same way if someone else had produced it? John Fogerty believed the answer was no, and the evidence supported him. Every hit was his. Every arrangement was his. Every decision that mattered was his. He later said in an interview, "I don't think we would have found any success had I not written any songs or had someone else been the lead singer. Me and the fellas would have been playing down at a local club somewhere." He wasn't being arrogant, he was being accurate, and that accuracy made everything worse. By 1970, Creedence released Cosmo's Factory. It became their best-selling album, #1 on the Billboard chart. It included an 11-minute jam on Marvin Gaye's I Heard It Through the Grapevine that became a fan favorite. The band was at its commercial peak, but the recording sessions told a different story. Engineer Russ Gary later said that Cook, Clifford, and Tom Fogerty were only in the studio for 2 or 3 days. The rest of the time, it was just John. Overdubbing keyboards, adding saxophone parts, layering vocals, building the album himself, piece by piece, while the others waited to be called in to play their parts. And there were rumors, never fully confirmed but never denied, that John would sometimes go back to the studio after the others had left for the night and re-record their parts himself. Every guitar lick, every bass line, every drum fill, replacing their work with his own, then showing up the next day like nothing had happened. Whether that's entirely true doesn't matter. What matters is that it's believable. And the fact that it's believable tells you everything about how this band operated. Tom Fogerty had finally had enough. In early 1971, after the recording of Pendulum, he quit. The older brother who'd started the whole thing, who'd brought the four of them together, who'd been the first to dream about making records, walked away from the biggest band in America because he couldn't stand being invisible inside his own brother's shadow anymore. And behind the scenes, something even more poisonous was happening. Saul Zaentz, the owner of Fantasy Records, was playing divide and conquer. He flattered Cook and Clifford, told them they could be solo stars, promised them individual record deals if they stayed loyal to the label. He was driving a wedge between the band members and John, making sure they'd never present a united front in their ongoing battle over the terrible contract they'd all signed years ago. The promised solo deals, of course, never materialized, but the damage was done. Tom had gotten close to Zaentz. He would later call him his best friend. That detail would become the single most devastating sentence in the entire Creedence story. But we'll get there. John barely reacted to Tom's departure, at least not publicly. The remaining three considered replacing Tom, even discussed bringing in Duck Dunn from Booker T and the MGs, but ultimately decided to continue as a trio. And then John did something that would become the most debated decision in the band's entire history. He told Stu and Doug that going forward, Creedence would be a democracy. Each member would write, sing, and produce their own songs. 3 songs apiece on the next album. Equal contributions, equal credit, equal responsibility. Now, on the surface, that sounds like exactly what they'd been asking for. Creative input, a voice, a seat at the table. But here's the problem. Stu Cook and Doug Clifford had never written songs for Creedence before. They'd never sung lead vocals on a CCR record. They'd spent a decade playing other people's music. And now, overnight, they were expected to produce material at the same level as one of the greatest songwriters in rock history. Was this a genuine gesture of partnership, or was it a trap? Doug Clifford says John was punishing them for supporting Tom. He says John wanted out and was cutting off his nose to spite his face. Cook says neither of them wanted to write or sing. They wanted input on decisions, not creative control of the songs themselves. John says they demanded it. They say he forced it. 40 years later, the accusations are so vehement on both sides that it's impossible to know for certain who's telling the truth. What we do know is the result. The album was called Mardi Gras. It came out in April 1972, and it answered the question that had been hanging over Creedence for years. What happens when the man who does everything stops doing everything? Rolling Stone critic John Landau wrote a review that became legendary for a single sentence. He called it, relative to the band's established level of performance, the worst album he'd ever heard from a major rock band. From Rolling Stone, about Creedence Clearwater Revival, the band that had been untouchable for 4 straight years. John's 3 songs were fine, more than fine. Sweet Hitchhiker had already been a top 10 hit as a single. Someday Never Comes was one of the most emotionally honest songs he'd ever written, a painful meditation on fathers leaving and sons inheriting their mistakes that still makes people reach for the tissue box decades later. Those tracks sounded like Creedence. They had the voice, the guitar tone, the urgency, the craftsmanship. Stu and Doug's songs sounded like something else entirely. Not terrible, not embarrassing in a vacuum, but placed next to John Fogerty's work on the same album, the gap in quality wasn't subtle. It was a canyon. It was the difference between a master craftsman and 2 guys trying their best. And their best, through no real fault of their own, simply wasn't at the same level. John later said he had a pretty good idea the album would be dreadful before it was released. He said he'd known these guys since junior high school and figured he had a good handle on their abilities. His phrase was, "I guess they deserve a shot," but he was dreading the results. The other 2 disagreed. They thought the album was really cool. John laughed about it years later. They changed their tune, he said, and that gap, that unbridgeable distance between John's songs and everyone else's, proved something nobody in the band wanted to admit out loud. Creedence Clearwater Revival wasn't a democracy that had been hijacked by a dictator. It was a one-man operation that had been dressed up as a band. And when the costume came off, everyone could see it. 6 months after Mardi Gras came out, on October 16, 1972, Creedence Clearwater Revival officially announced their breakup. 4 years of dominance, 14 top 10 singles, done. But the breakup wasn't even the worst part. What came next made the breakup look clean by comparison. John Fogerty disappeared into himself. The anger consumed him, not just at his bandmates, at Fantasy Records, at Saul Zaentz, the label owner who'd signed them to contracts that John considered fundamentally unfair, at the entire system that had turned his songs into someone else's property. He stopped playing Creedence songs entirely, for nearly 15 years. 15 years of silence from the man who wrote some of the most recognizable songs in American history. Think about that. The man who wrote Proud Mary and Fortunate Son and Bad Moon Rising and Who'll Stop the Rain refused to sing any of them. If one of his own songs came on the car radio, he'd change the station. He said he had so much anger he was afraid he'd start singing Proud Mary and go off on a tirade. He stopped playing guitar altogether for stretches. He was, by his own admission, a bitter person. The darkness lasted years. He released a couple of solo albums that went largely unnoticed. The Blue Ridge Rangers in 1973, where he played every single instrument himself, as if to prove one more time that he didn't need anyone else. Then, a self-titled album in 1975 that included the original version of Rockin' All Over the World, a song that ironically became a much bigger hit when Status Quo covered it. He recorded another album called Hoodoo, completed it, and then destroyed it because he decided it wasn't good enough. That's the level of perfectionism we're talking about. He'd rather have nothing than have something imperfect. And then came the lawsuits. Fantasy Records, owned by Saul Zaentz, still controlled the rights to every song John had written as part of CCR. When John left Fantasy for Asylum Records, he had to forfeit those rights to get out of his contract. Every song, Proud Mary, Fortunate Son, Bad Moon Rising, all of them belonged to Zaentz. In 1985, John finally came back with Centerfield, his comeback album. It was massive, #1. The title track became a baseball anthem that's still played in stadiums today. But the album also included 2 songs that were barely disguised attacks on Zaentz. One was called Zans Can't Dance. The lyrics described a pig who can't dance but will steal your money. Zaentz sued for defamation. $144 million. It settled out of court. The song was retitled Vans Can't Dance on later pressings. But that wasn't the strangest lawsuit. That was still coming. Fantasy Records listened to the album's lead single, The Old Man Down the Road, and decided it sounded too much like Run Through the Jungle, a CCR song from 1970, a song John had also written. They sued John Fogerty for plagiarizing himself. A man was taken to court for stealing from his own songbook. During the 2-week trial, Fogerty brought his guitar to the witness stand. He played both songs for the jury, demonstrating note by note why they were different compositions. The jury agreed. He won. But the victory cost him $1 million in legal fees. And the betrayal cut even deeper when he learned that it was reportedly his own former bandmate, Stu Cook, who had pointed out the similarities to Zaentz in the first place. Fogerty wrote in his memoir that he felt stabbed in the back. Meanwhile, Tom Fogerty's story was ending in the worst way possible. Tom had left Creedence in 1971 and released several solo albums that went largely unnoticed. He never came close to the success he'd had with his brother, and the relationship between the brothers remained broken. They barely spoke. In the late 1980s, Tom had back surgery. During the procedure, he received a blood transfusion. The blood was tainted. Tom contracted HIV. As he lay dying in an Arizona hospital, Tom made one request. He wanted to play music with John one more time. Just the 4 of them, even if it was only in a living room. One last song together before the end. John said no. He didn't say no out of cruelty. He said no because the last words Tom had spoken to him during one of their final conversations were 6 words that John could never forgive. Tom had said, "Saul Zaentz is my best friend." The man who had cheated them, the man who owned their songs, the man who sued John for plagiarizing himself. Tom had called him his best friend. John couldn't get past it, and so he didn't play. Stu Cook later said that by the time John finally agreed, Tom could barely lift his arm. Too late. Tom Fogerty died on September 9, 1990. He was 48 years old. The cause was tuberculosis, a complication of AIDS. He left behind a wife and 6 children, and a brother who would have to live with the silence. At Tom's funeral, John delivered the eulogy. He said, "We wanted to grow up and be musicians. I guess we achieved half of that, becoming rock and roll stars. We didn't necessarily grow up." 3 years later, Creedence Clearwater Revival was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Bruce Springsteen made the induction speech. He called Fogerty an Old Testament shaggy-haired prophet, severe, precise, a man who said what he had to say and got out of there. It should have been a celebration. It became the saddest chapter of the band's entire story. Tom's widow, Tricia, came to the ceremony. She brought the urn containing her husband's ashes. She expected a reunion. She expected the surviving members to honor Tom by playing together one last time. John refused. He'd made it clear to the Rock Hall organizers months in advance. He would not play with Stu Cook and Doug Clifford. Instead, he recruited Bruce Springsteen, Robbie Robertson, and a group of session musicians. They rehearsed for a month, 3 songs. Who'll Stop the Rain, Born on the Bayou, Green River. Doug Clifford went to the venue that afternoon to check which drum kit he'd be using. A stagehand told him the truth. He wasn't playing. Nobody had told him. He'd been rehearsing nothing. When the performance started, Cook and Clifford, seated across the ballroom with their families, stood up and walked out. "It was a cold and selfish thing to do," Clifford said later, "but that's John." Springsteen later wrote a letter of apology. In 1995, Cook and Clifford formed Creedence Clearwater Revisited, a band dedicated to playing the songs John had written. John sued to stop them from using the name. He lost. They toured for 25 years, playing John's music to fans who wanted to hear it, until they finally retired in 2020. And John? John eventually made peace with the songs. It took a long time. Bob Dylan told him that if he didn't start singing Proud Mary, everybody would think the song belonged to Tina Turner. George Harrison encouraged him too. Slowly, reluctantly, Fogerty began reintroducing CCR material into his solo shows in the late 1980s. He tours to this day, performing the catalog he built, backed by a band that includes his own sons. The concerts are joyful now, loose. The bitterness has faded, or at least gone underground. And the music? The music never stops selling. Chronicle, the greatest hits compilation, released in 1976, has been on the Billboard chart for over 750 weeks. It's been certified 12 times platinum. Over 12 million copies sold in the United States alone. People who weren't alive when Creedence existed are buying the album. The songs have outlived the anger, the lawsuits, the silence, and the grief. In 2023, John finally acquired the global publishing rights to the Creedence catalog. After 50 years, the songs were his again. And in 2025, he released Legacy, a full re-recorded version of the classic CCR songs, performed with his current band. His version of Taylor Swift's Playbook. The original recordings still exist. But now there's another version, John's version, the version where nobody else's fingerprints are on the glass. So let's answer the question, what was the John Fogerty problem? It wasn't that he was too controlling. Every great band has a leader. Every hit factory has someone making the hard calls. The Beatles had Lennon and McCartney. The Rolling Stones had Jagger and Richards. The Beach Boys had Brian Wilson. Control isn't the problem. Control is the engine. The problem was that John Fogerty was too necessary. He didn't just lead the band, he was the band. The songs were his, the voice was his, the arrangements, the production, the vision, the quality control, the work ethic, the standard, all his. Remove any one of those things and Creedence still sounds like Creedence. Remove John and there's nothing left but a rhythm section looking for a song to play. And when the other 3 members asked for equality, they weren't asking for something unreasonable. They were asking for something impossible. Because equality means everyone contributes at the same level. And nobody in Creedence could match John Fogerty's level. Not Tom, not Stu, not Doug. That's not an insult to any of them. It's just the math of genius. You can't distribute it by vote. So when John finally gave them what they wanted, democracy, the result proved what everyone already knew but nobody wanted to say out loud. Without John Fogerty running every detail, Creedence Clearwater Revival didn't sound like Creedence Clearwater Revival anymore. The brand collapsed the moment the man behind it stepped aside. The band didn't collapse because one man had too much power. It collapsed because one man had too much talent. And talent, unlike power, can't be redistributed by committee. John Fogerty built a machine so efficient, so perfectly calibrated to his own abilities, that when the engine stopped, nothing else could keep it moving. The other parts were fine on their own, functional, professional, good enough for any other band. But Creedence wasn't any other band. Creedence was the standard, and the standard was John. Doug Clifford once described meeting John in that music room. A shy kid playing Fats Domino on the piano. Authentic Fats. Every note perfect. That perfectionism never left. It built the greatest American rock band of its generation. And then, it dismantled it, piece by piece, because perfection doesn't share well. That's the John Fogerty problem. Not ego, not stubbornness, not cruelty. Necessity. The band depended on one person's genius, and when that person stopped, there was nobody to take the wheel. Not because they weren't allowed to drive, but because none of them knew the road. Remember that music room in El Cerrito, 1959, a shy kid playing Fats Domino on the piano. Another kid walking over to say, "That's authentic Fats." They were 14 years old. They had no money, no connections, and no idea that the next decade would turn them into one of the biggest bands the world had ever seen. They played together for 13 years. They dominated American music for 4 of them. And then they spent the next 50 fighting over who deserved credit for those 4 years. One of them is dead, taken by a disease he caught from a blood transfusion, estranged from his brother until the very end. 2 of them spent decades touring under a name they didn't own, playing songs they didn't write, honoring a band that couldn't survive its own success. And the one who wrote those songs spent 15 years refusing to sing them because the anger was so deep he was afraid of what would come out if he opened his mouth. 4 boys from California who just wanted to play rock and roll. They got exactly what they wanted, and it cost them everything they had. The music, though? The music survived all of it. 12 million copies of Chronicles sold, 750 weeks on the Billboard chart. Fortunate Son still playing at rallies, at football games, in movies about wars that ended before the listeners were born. The songs outlasted the lawsuits, the silence, the betrayals, and the grief. They're bigger than the men who made them, and maybe that's the final answer to the John Fogerty problem. The machine he built was so good that even after it broke apart, the pieces kept working, just never together again. If this story stayed with you, there's another one you need to hear. It's about a different band that faced the same impossible question. What happens when one person is the band, and the band can't survive without them? That video is on screen right now. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. New ones drop every week.